Welcome to this webinar on persistent or chronic pain, as it's more commonly known. I'm going to give you a different perspective on how and why pain develops, give you an understanding of how the perfect storm can appear in someone's life where they develop persistent pain, and give you an understanding and an awareness of how you can reverse that pattern and go towards recovery and a life free from persistent pain. My name is Drew Coverdale. I'm a physiotherapist and I work in the United Kingdom. I've been a physiotherapist for over 25 years. I have a particular interest in persistent pain and helping people understand it from their perspective, help therapists work with people who have persistent pain on their recovery path. And the bottom line is essentially that you are letting people know that they can reverse persistent pain. It isn't something that has to be managed, it isn't something they have to accept is fixed in time. It can be reversed. And it's taking people from that maybe place of disbelief, showing them the evidence that is now being gathered and showing them that they have the powers within themselves, maybe with the help of somebody else, but they have the powers within themselves to recover. So I'm particularly interested in this field and have done for several years. Throughout my career, I've probably sat down in front of about 75,000 people and asked them about pain. And maybe for the first 20 years, I used what I felt on the tip of my fingers and the tip of my tongue that intuitively help people, but there was always a category of patients with persistent pain that found it difficult to help. But now I recognise the neuroscience behind reversing persistent pain is more. It sits more within a behaviour change approach. It doesn't mean the structural and physical elements aren't relevant and you can't use movement to help people make changes, but it isn't the traditional physio approaches because they've been found really over the longer term not to help in persistent pain. So with these principles, they help people tap into mechanisms that they can use themselves. It's using that behaviour change approach to give people the agency and feel empowered that they can help themselves. And actually it's very counterintuitive because we feel that once the pain's gone that we'll feel better. Well, in reality, if you're able to make yourself feel better, make your brain and body represent that or do something that represents that, that has power on changing the pain. Because pain is just a signal for you to attend to you. That's it, no more, no less. We know it can come with damage, but you can have pain when there's no damage. You can have pain when there is damage. You can have damage when there's no pain. Think of a time that you've had pain without damage, and that might be if you put your hand on a radiator and it's warned you that it's too hot. You take your fingers off and you realise there's no damage there. The pain's there as a protective mechanism. Think of when you've woke up one morning and had a bruise and then not remembered when that happened. So the damage occurs without pain. Think of another time of your life that's really describe it as a painful situation, maybe an emotional situation in your life. There's no actual physical damage there, but we describe that as a painful experience because of how that feels. So pain doesn't always indicate that there's damage, but culturally quite often now we present with pain, we see someone with pain and the first thing we do is we look for damage. So you can have physical injuries, a twisted ankle, broken bones, cuts, bruises, degenerative changes that, yes, can be found with pain, but those elements can exist in people without the same level of pain, and the pain doesn't stay until the tissue's healed. It normally goes long before the tissue has healed. Think of emotional pain. Again, that's one of those situations that's physically painful because the emotional charge we experience, and yet there's no tissue damage in that moment. And pain is simply a protective mechanism to allow us to get out of the situation we're in, survive it, or prevent it happening again if it looks like it could be dangerous to us as an organism. There's 4 very simple ways to understand this mechanism of protection. Think of water and food as categories where the body will allow you a certain level before it starts to warn you that you have to top up and eat food and top up and drink water. There's a sequence of warnings that they'll start with a dry mouth, maybe thirst, someone might feel a little bit irritated or lightheaded. If you went all the way through the day and then didn't do anything, you'd find that very likely someone would have a headache at the end of the day and they realise it's from not drinking. There is no damage in that moment. It's simply a protective mechanism beyond the early warning systems that have maybe been overridden or ignored. The same happens with food. Don't eat for a few days. Go beyond what the body can cope with. They'll start to get a series of warnings that tell you to attend to yourself before damage occurs. So a headache might come with a lack of water, stomach ache might come with a lack of food. They all come before tissue damage, before organ failure and death, because beyond those thresholds, it's really dangerous for the organism to go past. Now, if you think about physical stimulus, heat, chemical, pressure, these receptors in our skins that warn us of those things, the same thing applies. You can feel pain from becoming so close to the threshold of damage, but actually no damage can occur, and it can still be a very extremely painful situation. If there is damage, often we associate pain with it, but again, it's a protective mechanism to alert us to the fact there's been damage. And that's when the stimulus is so fast that we might not have been able to attend to that situation. And then it gets us to assess that situation so that we can allow the body to heal from the physical injury if one has occurred. Now, the 4th and most commonly misunderstood concept is the psychological element of fear. So the psychological awareness of threat comes again with an emotional charge to get you to attend to a situation you may be concerned about, or to get out of that situation, just to deal with it. Again, there's a series of warnings that we feel in emotionally charged situations, and those are ones we enjoy or don't enjoy. The same mechanism occurs, but there's a certain threshold that appears that we can override so many situations, and then the brain has the ability to use pain to trigger that conscious awareness of the state of threat that the organism's in before damage. And this is a fascinating thing, that as soon as you get certainty in any one of these situations, as soon as you understand the information that's required, why you're feeling like that and what you have to do to reverse it, and you get a sense of control, and those 3 elements are related to the stress response. As soon as you get them, the stress response drops. But when we sense a pain and we don't get those 3 elements, then the processing that should occur to alleviate the stress response, once we focus on the thing causing our pain, we understand the meaning of it. If that processing doesn't happen, it leaves us vulnerable. So we have this uncertainty, this lack of information, or loss of control, and those 3 elements define the stress response. So every time you focus on pain, where it is, how it comes, how it presents, where not having the meaning for it, that repeats that sense of uncertainty, that lack of control, and that loss, that lack of information and loss of control. That drives the stress mechanism related to that particular stimulus. And that's where pain can last lots longer than it takes for tissue healing to occur, or actually when there's been no real tissue structural damage to be concerned about, or any structural elements are not the sole cause of that ongoing structural pain. And if you look at there's only 4 reasons really that structural pain can be caused by these 4 elements. So you've got cancer, an autoimmune disease, ongoing infection, or an undiagnosed fracture. Now, they're the only things that can cause ongoing structural pain. But it doesn't mean that if you have another structural element, it isn't relevant in that picture of constant pain. It just means that that alone isn't the driver for it. It's a component in it. But often there's condition responses related to that structural element that give it this ongoing constant pattern, where really it's only these four more sinister elements that are found in the literature to be the cause of constant persistent pain. You can still have these elements and not have pain. It's just they're the only ones seen in the literature consistently that can be attributable to constant pain. Many people have other structural elements that they believe is the cause of that pain: trapped nerves, arthritis, degeneration, cartilage tears, bursitis, tendon damage. So there's a structural element they might have evidence for or with from scans and x-rays or what they've been told. Those areas of the body are relevant in terms of where the pain presents, but the structural element is only one part of the picture. It isn't the whole picture. We are wired, though, when we feel pain in those areas, just to look for the bite, the sting, the twist, the turn, the pathology in the moment. It's how we're wired. But sometimes it's an illusion when we get a physical pain that we only look for the physical element. Often there's an emotional charge behind it. So the first things we use, the treatment we use for it, the reaction we use for it, just doesn't resolve it. The symptoms don't settle. We might get more tests, we might get other different treatments. These tests might come back negative and we still feel the pain. Sometimes they come with positive findings, but that's almost an illusion to tell us that that thing that's been found, even though it can present in lots of people who don't have pain, our sense of frustration means that we chase that as the only element behind the pain. When you look at pain that goes beyond 3 to 6 months, even if you give it the benefit of doubt of 3 months further rehab, and the person still has this pain long after it makes sense to them, or often the people they see, it often means there's an emotional charge attached to it. It means there's those 3 elements of uncertainty, a lack of information, a loss of control, and that's the stress response attached to it. Every time the person places focus on it or senses the pain, it triggers that automated stress response. And we know now that emotional pain and physical pain, they are processed in the same parts of the brain. So you can see how there's different pathways, different ways that pain can manifest in someone beyond just physical injury. So to think that all pain and chronic pain is due to ongoing damage or ongoing physical element alone is somewhat of an illusion. Not a very pleasant one, but somewhat of an illusion. That misinterpretation means that quite often people use behaviours, treatments based on the wrong belief. The belief is that it's solely physical, and those treatments or behaviours or actions or reactions are just destined to failure. They become the tipping point. That misinterpretation of the meaning of that pain becomes the tipping point for the pain to stay. But it's totally natural to want to escape pain, but quite often, because it's so reactive, we use that fight, flight, or freeze, or fawn response. They're the quickest ways to feel better. But when we're using those physical escape routes to pain that has emotional charge, we're actually using emotional reactive behaviours for a pain that has an emotionally driven source. And it simply repeats the cycle that maintains that pain. Think of the thoughts that we have a day, ranging from 10 to 70,000 thoughts per day. It depends where you look. You can Google the information, but we have a lot of thoughts per day. And in that moment that someone has pain, rather than the rest and digest, allowing themselves time to recover, care and compassion, which is the perfect storm or situation to recover from pain, if we have a belief that there's a physical element that we are trying to do something to fight that, run away from it, we fear it, we're frustrated by it, we're freezing in the presence of it, then that means that these are the thoughts that get repeated. And any behavior gets repeated like that in a highly stressful state starts to become automated by the brain, starts to be its own driver of the pain, because the tissue heals if there is any healing to do, but the perpetual prediction of the future, which seems terrible, and reflection on the past that might have been awful, starts to increase the repetition of this stress cycle, and it links to the pain so that it almost becomes an habitual mechanism beyond the conscious awareness of the person doing the behavior. So our behaviors start to create the pain. Our pain triggers the behaviors, and you get this cycle where it's round and round and round. And that's the cycle that people find very hard to break. Often the behaviors are rooted in a safety mechanism. So fight, flight, freeze, or fawn. These are behaviors that we do intuitively to take us towards a place of safety. So it's seen as pleasurable and encoded as pleasurable in the unconscious part of your brain. It's not even a conscious part of your brain. The pleasure and routine centers of your brain encode behaviors as pleasurable if they take you towards safety. And this can start in childhood. So if there's been a repetitive use of a particular behavior in childhood to make the person feel safe, it becomes the default behavior to use in the stressful situation in life when stressful things appear. And it can be that excessive use of those behaviors that eventually can drive pain, or if trauma repeats in life, they can be the behaviors that stop the person from recovering from that pain and fully resolving that trauma of the moment. The brain can make mistakes and take wrong actions, and we can consciously do the same. We can make mistakes and take wrong actions. If they've worked for us in the past, it's very counterintuitive to think, well, why wouldn't I use them again? If those behaviors are invisible to us and the same kind of pushing past and carrying on in life have brought rewards, then why wouldn't we use them again to overcome pain? That's okay if it's a real physical emergency, but when there's an emotional driver to how we feel and we're using excessive emotional charges to overcome it, we're making a mistake. In that time you should be recovering, it actually presents as the time where we habituate and develop this persistent pain pattern. And that means it's not your fault. It can happen to any of us. Yes, there's patients and people that have kind of a potential to develop more than others, but it can happen to anyone. But because it's an unconscious mechanism that people are using, it's never their fault. It happens to so many people, about 1 billion people in the world, 1 in 5. And we know that the traditional responses and to treatments are very, very poor. Tablets, surgery, manual therapy. You might get transient relief with these things, but them alone, without looking at the emotional charges and the behaviours and the beliefs underneath it, are pretty much futile. There's a range of conditions that this occurs in. There's a list there of some of the more common ones that we see that come across as the more chronic conditions. And many of the behaviours that we see are actually linked across all of these conditions. Again, it's not the person's fault, but when they don't respond to treatment and people can't see findings on x-rays or scans, or the findings that they do see don't explain the length of time that the symptoms have been there, then the person might feel it's their fault, but there isn't anybody to blame, neither the practitioners or the people themselves in pain, because all the behaviours are unconscious. Many times people say that my disease is invisible, my pain is invisible. Well, more in reality, it's that the behaviours they exhibit are invisible, and those are the behaviours that can be changed. It's a big shift. It's a big shift in terms of how you approach persistent pain. Yes, the tissue element, the physical part that pain is represented is important, but it isn't the only part of the story. Seeing that shift, making a transition to a broader perspective, understand why the pain's there, is difficult for clinicians and patients. But if you can be open to the idea that there's another way to reverse persistent pain, then you give yourself the option that's alternate to the belief that you have to live with and manage your pain. Lauren Mosley said recently that what we know about persistent pain puts recovery right back on the table, and that's so true. The thing is, humans have always had the ability to recover. Maybe you've lost touch with that ability, but simplifying treatment processes means that you can reverse persistent pain, or you possess the ability to do that from within yourself. The pain habit is really based around explaining to people that those unconscious beliefs, automated behaviours, reactions to cues that trigger behaviours driving pain on, and these are things that can be reversed in a step-by-step way, means that the recovery pathway is available to everyone. You have to explore your beliefs. You have to look at your stress response currently, how it's been in the past, how you're responding to current stresses in your life. We have to respect the changes that are found on x-rays and scans, but you don't have to fear them. You have to know there might be predictive behaviours based around them and looking at changing those. It's fascinating to understand why this happened to you, why it happens to us. You don't have to look backwards to go forward, but it can present an interesting pathway into understanding the meaning behind our pain and how we might have developed some of the personality traits that are found consistently in people who develop persistent pain. And knowing all those things can make you feel empowered. You can start to use new behaviours, habituate them, and then start to capitulate the pain. It's creating new ways to think, new ways to breathe, new ways to move, and new ways to emotionally express how you feel. There's a very simple ABC mechanism, and this is from B.J. Fogg, who's a behavioural scientist in America, and you can look up his work. But applying this to pain and rewarding new behaviours in tiny ways starts to provide the potential and the mechanism through which you can reverse persistent pain. You're anchoring new behaviour. You're choosing a new behaviour for that anchor, and you're celebrating as you do it. There's so much free information on the website and on the YouTube channel that you can explore this at your leisure. There's the book, free resources, and you can look on the website for any other options of looking at how you can help yourself reverse persistent pain. It isn't an easy step, but the steps you can take are possible. You don't have to accept that pain has to be managed, that pain has to be something that you live with persistently. The path to recovery exists. It starts with a step. Starts with a step in different directions for different people. Once you can think, breathe, move and feel, and use all of those tools together, you get this amplified effect of that sense of safety that starts creating the gaps in the pain that you might experience, and it can take you towards a life totally free from persistent pain.